In the last video, we introduced the ability to add additional windows into our project and then how to navigate between those windows. One of the next important features is the ability to be able to share data between windows. What this means is quite often we want to gather information from one window which we then want to present on another window. Therefore, that data has to be passed. So we're going to look at how we can pass data during the navigation process. So in the example we've got just now, we've got the user entering a value into this text box, which is intended to be their name. What we would like to do is actually take this value they enter, their name, and share it with the second window. So on the second window, I'm going to add in a text block which displays the name from the first window. So I'm going to add in a text block and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm just going to call it BLK for text block name. And again, I'm just going to up the pixel size and I'm going to take the word text block out. What that means is when I click off it, it does disappear, but it is still there. So the intention is that in this text block, what I would like to display is when the program runs, I would like to display the name the user's entered in this first window in here. So the idea is we're going to grab the data out of this text box, pass it across to this second window and display it in this text block. So the passing of data happens during the navigation. So let's take a look again at our navigation process. So in the main window, when we click on the next button, that's where we kick off the navigation. So here's the code for what happens when we click on the next button. So as discussed in the previous video, it creates the second window, window 2. It then displays that window to the user and then it closes the original. What we want to do is extend these instructions to also include the passing of data. The best way of thinking about passing data between windows is to imagine a game of throw and catch. So imagine you've got someone who has a baseball that's throwing and you've got the receiver who's got a glove that's catching. So in our case, the baseball is the data. So the first thing we need to do on the main window is when we kick off the navigation, we need to specify what it is we're throwing across, what the data is. So where we do that is we actually put the details into the step that creates the next window. So in the very first step, we say create the new window, and inside these brackets, we put details of any data we want to pass to this new window. So the data we want to pass is the contents of, in this case, this text box. So this text box is called txt name. So in here, I'm going to pass txt name, and I want to specifically pass the text value. So whatever text the user has typed into the text box called txt name, that's the bit of data I'm going to pass to window 2 when I create it. So effectively, this is what we're throwing across. Now you'll notice here this is underlined red, and that's because we've only got one side of the deal in place. We've got the throwing, so now we need to move to the new window so we can actually do the catching. So let's now move over to window 2. So at this point here, when it creates window 2, it calls the window 2 constructor. So that's where we need to do the catching. So let's go into window 2. Here's the window 2 constructor. Remember, it's got the same name as class. And again, in the brackets is where we need to set up the catching. Now the catching is a little bit more complicated because when we catch the data, we need to think about this scenario of having the baseball, which has been thrown, and the glove, which then catches the baseball. So we need to effectively set up a glove, something to catch it. So in our case, we're setting up a variable, a container to catch the data. So what's being passed is we're throwing across a bit of data out of a text box. So the type of data is going to be a string. So to set up the variable, remember, variables require a type, so we know how big the container needs to be. So what type of data are we catching? We're catching a string. And then the second part is we need to stick a label in that container so that we can find it again in memory. So I'm just going to call it name, because that's effectively what's going to be thrown across as the name. So now you'll notice if we go back, you'll see that the underline in red has disappeared. That's because we've now got both sides of the deal in place. So we've got the throwing of the data, which basically just in the brackets we put whatever bit of data is we want to share. And then in the new window, in the constructor, we have the catching, which involves setting up a variable, which requires the data type to get the right size and a label to stick on it so we can find it again. So at this point, we have now successfully passed a bit of data. However, if I run it, you'll see that there's no evidence of this to the user. So here's the first window. I am going to type in a name and I'm going to click on next. And you'll notice when the window pops up, there's nothing in the text block. The text block is empty. Now we have actually passed the data. We've done the throwing and the catching, but we need to do the final part. So once we've caught the data, we need to then take this data and put it into the text block. That's the part we've not done yet. So where do we want to put the data? We want to put it in the text block. So the text block is called BLK name. So we want to, once the window has been built, so remember this builds the window. Once it's been built, we want to go to the text block called BLK name, and we want to update the text property to give it a new value. And the value we want it to have is whatever is stored inside this variable. So whatever data has been thrown across. So we simply use the label. So the label grabs that data that's been thrown across, it grabs it back out of memory, and it puts it into the text block. So let's run this again. So we have our first window, and I'm going to put in a name. Click on next, and this time you'll see, I'll drag the window over onto my screen, it opens up the second window and the text block successfully has the piece of data that we've shared, that we've passed. And again, I can go back and I can change it to something else. So let's change it to Bob, for instance. Click on next, and you'll see again it shares that information. So passing data is a really simple thing to do as long as you get both ends of the deal in place. So you need to throw the data when you set off the navigation. So this is us throwing the bit of data across, and then in the new window, in the constructor, you need to catch the data. And of course, the last step is once you've caught the data, then you need to actually use it and display it onto the screen. Remember, with these instructions, as I mentioned before, it's always easier to actually read them from right to left. So this is saying, take whatever value is inside name, inside the variable name, and put it into the text property of the text block called BLK name. So reading right to left always makes a bit more sense. If you wanted to pass additional bits of data, we could extend this further. So let's do that just now. Let's go back to the main window and let's add in a second bit of information. So please enter your name. Let's add in another label. Squeeze this in. 30 pixels and change it to say, please enter your status, let's just say. So what we mean by this is, are you a student or are you a lecturer? Just make that a wee bit bigger so it fits in. There we go. And I'm going to grab across another text box so they can actually enter their value. This time I'm going to give the text box a name because I want to be able to access this text box from a code so I can get the data out of it. So I'm going to call it txt status. And again, I'm going to up it to 30 pixels. And I don't want it to say text box, so I'll remove that from the text property. Okay, so I've now got a second bit of data. So I'm going to go back into the navigation button, and I'm already sending that first bit of data. To send a second bit of data, simple, comma, and then whatever the identity is of the second bit of data. So the second bit of data is the contents of the txt status text box, and particularly I want to grab the text out of it. So now I'm passing the text from the name text box and the text from the status text box. And you'll see again this is underlined red. And that's because I'm now throwing 2 bits of data, but right now I'm only catching 1. So I need to go and update this constructor to now catch a second bit of data. So let's go to Window 2's constructor. So here we are back at Window 2's constructor, and I'm going to catch a second bit of data. So again, what type of data is it that's been thrown? It's data from a text box, so it's going to be a string. And what labels I want to put on it. I can put anything on it at all. I'm going to call it status. So now, if I go back, you'll see that the red's underline is gone because I've now sealed the agreement. I've got throwing of 2 bits of data and I've got catching of 2 bits of data. So it's quite happy that I've got that set up correctly. The last thing I'll need to do is I need to add that status to the text block. So what I can actually do here is I can just simply add it to the same text block. So I can say display the name, and I'll put in a space, display 1 bit of white space, and display the status. So let's run this again and see what happens. So we get our first window where we're asked to enter data. So I'll better put in an actual name this time. So I'll put in my name, and I am a lecturer. Click on next and drag this across. Oh, I've not noticed I've not spelled welcome correctly. Welcome to the second window, and you'll see it's now displaying Dawn, then space, and then status, which is lecturer. And of course we can navigate back again if we want, and we can change it to something else. So let's say Bob, and Bob is our student. Navigate, and you can see it successfully passes the bits of data. There's no limit on how many bits of data you pass. It's the same process. Just keep adding in commas, keep throwing another bit of data, and make sure you've got the catch at the other side. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. So you can have a wee play around with adding in windows now, navigation, and sharing data.